sort of are able to fall out of love after that. So so definitely reading in our time was the beginning for me, and that was many years ago now, for loving Hemingway and starting to do research on Hemingway and other jazz age writers. The interest in baseball actually came from Hemingway because he was such a huge fan himself, as you'll hear in the presentation that I'm going to give. And I realized if I wanted to write about Hemingway in the 1920s fully, and especially his American experience, I had to know more about baseball. And then baseball became sort of an obsession as well. So, but I have Hemingway to thank for this. I mean, I'm Canadian. I grew up in Alberta, so I grew up watching hockey. I grew up watching the Edmonton Oilers as they were winning all their Stanley Cups. So baseball is a recent passion, and I have Hemingway to thank for that.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I'll let you continue with your presentation, and I'll rejoin you at the end to discuss any questions that are brought up. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I want to begin with a story about this ticket stub, which is in Oak Park. This is a part of the Hemingway Foundation archives in Oak Park. And this was a very precious ticket stub for Hemingway because we know the story of this ticket stub, and we know that this was something that he took to war. This is Ernest Hemingway in his formal military photograph from 1918, and this is also in the Foundation collection. So this is, again, something that is unique to Oak Park. This is not a military uniform in terms of someone who is bearing arms. Hemingway did not have good eyesight, so he participated in the World War I effort by volunteering to be a Red Cross volunteer, and this was the uniform he wore for that role. And this is the game that the ticket stub goes with. It was a May game in 1918, just before he shipped to Europe to take up his Red Cross duties. And I've given you pictures of two of the White Sox players that Hemingway saw that day. He was in New York. It was a game of the Chicago White Sox against the New York Yankees at the Polo Grounds. And you'll see the names underneath. I don't know how clearly you can read them, but one of them is Eddie Seacott. He's the White Sox pitcher. And the other one is George Buck Weaver. And so I guess I would say to you to think for a moment, why do those names seem familiar? And these two men were phenomenal baseball players, but that's not actually the main reason why they are so well known today. And so think about that to yourselves, and I will come back and answer that question, and we'll see if you knew the answer to that. So Hemingway went off to serve in the Red Cross, as mentioned, and he wasn't in Europe very long before he was injured on July 8th, 1918. And this photograph is a photograph I took at the Key West Museum of Art and History at the Custom House, which you can see, you can still see the blood stains around his knee. Hemingway sustained very serious injuries. He had a lot of shrapnel in his knee. And so his participation in the war effort ended here. After this, he is moved around from hospital to hospital and spends time recuperating in Italy. And all this time, he had the baseball stub with him. And that's, Keith mentioned that there's a link in the chat to an article that I wrote about the ticket stub. And I also referenced some other fantastic articles in there. If you want to know the whole history of the game that Hemingway watched that day, there's a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, Sean Calloway. He's written an article, and there's a link to it in my article, where he tells you the whole story of the game, so you can see it the way Hemingway saw it. There's also a terrific article, and again, linked in my article, written by a former archivist from Oak Park about the history of this ticket stub. So lots has been written about this. But think how precious this is. This tells you really something about Hemingway and his relationship to baseball, that this ticket stub meant so much to him that he carried it with him from the time he was in America through those experiences in war, including being injured, and all the way home again at the beginning of 1919. The ticket stub journeyed with him that whole time. And I think he must have hung on to this because it meant so much to him, not only because he loved baseball, but it's this sign of home, and also this memory of Oak Park in Chicago, because it was a game that involved his White Sox, who at the time were major champions. They had just won the World Series in 1917. Now, the question I asked you about Eddie Cicotte and Buck Weaver, why did they seem familiar? Those names will probably seem familiar to you if you have seen the movie 8 Men Out, or you have read other things about the Black Sox scandal. And that was the game fixing scandal in 1919. Both Eddie Cicotte and Buck Weaver, who were players that Ernest Hemingway saw in New York on that day before he shipped off to Europe, they were both implicated in the Black Sox scandal and accused of having thrown games in exchange for payment from gamblers. And of course, if you really know this story, you'll know that there have been people who have said that Buck Weaver was unfairly accused that he played really well in the final series, and he may have known about the fix but didn't participate in it. And that's certainly the angle that the movie takes. At any rate, Hemingway was involved in the Black Sox scandal, and he was implicated in the sense that he believed in the White Sox, and he actually bet on them to win in 1919. And then later on, really was saddened by the confessions, the White Sox confessions, and was in Chicago proper. He was actually working in Chicago when the Black Sox scandal trial took place. And so he was actually just down the street. So this is all part of Hemingway's story as well. And if you want to read about Hemingway and the Black Sox scandal, the article that I have up here with that name is published by the Society for American Baseball Research, and you can always Google that. So Hemingway was born in the right place for someone who was going to end up as a baseball fan. He was born in a baseball city. And of course, since this talk is given by the foundation, important to have a picture of his birthhouse, which is of course now their museum. Chicago was a major big baseball city, and it was really huge right at the beginning of the modern game. So, right at the turn of the century, you're getting the rules have fallen into place, the World Series has fallen into place, so that it is the way then as it is played now. You also have the first really big baseball stadiums opening up at the early years of the 20th century, including one in Chicago, Comiskey Park. And this is a photograph from opening day in 1910, a very impressive stadium. Chicago was also a championship city, and you can see on this slide how often, while Hemingway was growing up in Oak Park, the Chicago Cubs were either World Series contenders or actually World Series champions. And the White Sox were as well. So again, the White Sox were also, like the Cubs, often at the top of the game in the years that Hemingway was a child and an adolescent, and they were World Series champions in 1906 and 1917. And one of the photos I have on here, which I particularly love, is a baseball from the 1917 World Series that the White Sox won. I took that picture from the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, where they have that baseball. Chicago was also home to some of the best baseball players to ever play the game. And again, these are players who were playing the game while Hemingway was living in Oak Park, growing up in the area, and he could go to games and see these players. So this slide shows, these are tobacco cards from, again, the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame. And these cards show Tinker, Evers, and Chance, of course, very famous Cubs. You also had, during the years that Hemingway was growing up, Mordecai Three Finger Brown. And Three Finger was his nickname because, as you can see in the photograph there, that he had a childhood farm accident that meant that he lost part of one finger. But this meant that he had an incredible pitching grip, and he was a very, very famous, very well-respected pitcher while Hemingway was growing up, and he was very much admired by Hemingway. And then the other photograph here is Shoeless Joe Jackson, of course, another incredible player who Hemingway would have seen when he was growing up. So not only did Hemingway grow up in a baseball city, he grew up in a baseball family. And here on this slide, I've got the picture of, which is also in Oak Park, and hopefully you go on some of the Hemingway Foundation walks, which take you by here. And so this is where Hemingway was growing up while these things were going on, while he was watching Chicago baseball. And he was growing up in a baseball loving family. His father was a huge baseball fan. And I've just put on this slide a part of a letter that he wrote to his father when he was really small, asking if he could go to a Cubs game. And we don't know whether or not his father said yes, but I'm kind of suspecting he probably did, because Clarence loved baseball as well. So this was a love shared by father and son. It also is a love that goes farther back in the Hemingway family. And this is an amazing document. This is from the Wheaton College, where Hemingway's grandfather, paternal grandfather, went to school. This is Anson Hemingway. And you can actually see, if you look sort of 6 names, I think, down from the top, where it says Hemingway. So this is a box score, a very early box score. They looked more like cricket scores at that time. And showing that his grandfather was playing baseball at Wheaton College. He played third base there. So this really was a baseball. There was a baseball family. There was at least 2 generations of Hemingways who loved baseball, and this goes back to really early days of the game. So was Hemingway a Cubs or a White Sox fan? This is a question that I often get asked. And of course, now I understand in Chicago, most people do take sides. So I'm not taking sides today. I told Keith, I've got my Chicago Cubs shirt on, but I also brought a White Sox hat, which I can't wear because of my headset. But just to let you know, both things are in the house. So what about Hemingway? What do we know about his preferences? Well, this is the interesting thing. The Hemingway Letters Project, which is incredible, and I certainly recommend the books that are being collected, the Hemingway Letters. Volume 1 of the Hemingway Letters Project shows us the letters that he wrote when he was a child and an adolescent. And we know from those letters that at least twice, when Hemingway was a child, he ordered sporting action figures and sporting posters. And this is an ad that the one that's on the screen here is an ad that Hemingway actually responded to. We know that he wrote a letter in response to this advertisement, and he ordered several baseball action figures. So what we've learned from the baseball action figures that Hemingway ordered is that actually Hemingway appears to have had very eclectic taste. He ordered action figures and posters for both Cubs and White Sox players. And he also ordered images of players for other teams. He was a big fan of the Detroit Tigers. He was a huge fan of Christy Matheson, who played for the New York Giants. And so what we see here is that there isn't only one team for Hemingway. And my theory about that is that even when he was a child, Hemingway had a real fascination with excellence. He really loved seeing people live to their full potential. And if you think about how mad he got at F. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, for drinking so much, he was angry at Fitzgerald for not living up to his potential. So I think he really had this fascination with excellence, and it does play out anyway in his focus on a wide variety of baseball players from different teams. The main common denominator wasn't the team, it was how good they were. And here's an example, as I said, that he really liked Christy Matheson, who played for the New York Giants. Christy Matheson wrote a book called Pitching in a Pinch in 1912. And this is an interesting book. And even though he's not a Chicago baseball player, Pitching in a Pinch was available all over the United States. And I'm sure Hemingway would have read this book. They did have a copy at the Oak Park Public Library, and Hemingway's friends would have owned it as well. And he may have had his own copy. Christy Matheson in this book, I think, may have given Hemingway the kernel of the idea of what became the Hemingway Code. The famous Hemingway Code is grace under pressure. And this is something we very strongly associate with his writings. In Pitching in a Pinch, which came out when Hemingway was a child, Matheson talks about the fact that very often the entire weight of a game will hang on the pitcher, and under all this pressure, the pitcher has to come through. And so I really think that what he wrote in this book personifies what Hemingway would later personify himself in his own writing. Now, in this part of the presentation, I'm going to move into some Hemingway mysteries. And this is partly why Keith invited me back, because I gave the live version of this presentation last summer. And at that time, I said there were several Chicago baseball mysteries that hadn't been solved. I've been working on some of them since then. So we have a few answers for you. Not everything I'm going to show you now are going to be mysteries, but some of these are still mysteries and they haven't been solved. One of the Chicago baseball mysteries is whether Hemingway saw this game, the game that's advertised in this poster, which took place in September 1916. And the reason why this is an important question is because Hemingway was a huge fan of both Christy Matheson and Mordecai Three Finger Brown, and they played their final matchup in Chicago. And the game was not sold out. It didn't have great weather, and so it would have been possible for Hemingway to get a ticket. So the question is, did he go? As far as I know, he was in town at the time, and I believe he could have gone. I think he would have wanted to go, but we don't have definitive proof for something like this, like the ticket stub that I showed you earlier. And it would be great if one showed up. So keep your eyes open, and certainly in the archives, who knows what will turn up. Hemingway was a huge pack rat, so maybe it'll show up one day. Now, here's another baseball mystery for you. There are a series of photographs in the JFK Library in Boston where Hemingway's wife, Mary, left many of Hemingway's belongings. There are a series of baseball photos there that are attributed to Hemingway. When I asked the JFK why they think Hemingway took these photos and not his father, they said that their logic is that the negatives for these photos were with Mary, his fourth wife, whereas if they had been Clarence's photos, they might have ended up in Oak Park. They might never have left the area. At any rate, both Clarence and Hemingway loved baseball, so it's possible that either the father or the son took the photos. They were probably at the same game. Now the question, though, is which game? So I'm going to show you first the photos that we have. So those are the photos. There's 5 of them. And the question is, can we identify something about what game Hemingway and his father were at? Well, some of this mystery, as I said, we've been working on, and I can give you some possible answers now. So first of all, the same person I mentioned to you, the SABR member, Sean Kaloje, who wrote the great article about that ticket stub game, the game that Hemingway went to in New York before he went to war. He took a look at these photos, and he is based in Chicago, or just outside, so very kindly went to the Chicago Historical Archives and looked for me to see if we could start identifying things. And so you'll see from the clearer picture here, he went to the archives and found that this scoreboard definitely looks like the game was played in Comiskey Park. He also found this photo, again, the clearer one that you'll see, with the no betting allowed sign. You can see very clearly in the clear photo that Sean found at the Chicago Historical Archives. And then in Hemingway or Clarence's less clear photo, you'll see that the windows are the same windows, and you can see that no betting allowed sign. So this is definitely Comiskey Park. So then the question is, when is the game being played and who is playing? The JFK has labeled these photos as being sporting events photos from 1915, but that appears to be their best guess. It's not actually, as it would appear, something that we can entirely rely upon. So in order to try to get a better identification of when the photos were taken, I approached another SABR member, Carrie Smith, who specializes in baseball photographs, to have a look at these pictures as well. And Carrie did some digging, and what he found, this was for him the smoking gun. This is a photo of a Chicago City match between the Cubs and the White Sox from 1912. And what he found was that the advertisements on the scoreboard in this 1912 photo match. They match the ones in the Hemingway photo. So it is very likely that the game that Hemingway and Clarence were at was in 1912. So that helps to narrow things down a bit more. He also said that the uniforms, even though the photographs are kind of blurry, the uniforms in the photographs look like they might be, and this is very interesting, the Detroit Tigers, the people who are playing the White Sox in Comiskey Park. And this is what Carrie wrote to me. He said, the Tigers were the only American League team with a dark cap, dark stockings, and a logo on the breast of the jersey instead of a name written upon it. So that is really distinctive. So he thinks it's the Tigers, and actually that makes a lot of sense. because Hemingway really liked the Tigers. And so that is something that is entirely possible, that the Hemingway photos that I showed you, that they're showing the White Sox playing. It's only barely see some of the opposing players in some of the photos, but it's the White Sox playing the Tigers. And then Hemingway researcher John Hargrove, who works on Hemingway timelines, he did research on this, and he compared when the photos, when the games could have happened. So if it's a Tigers White Sox game, when those games happened in 1912, when Hemingway was in town, when the games were on school days, so he's unlikely to have attended, when the family was at Walloon Lake, so they couldn't have attended. And he thinks that it's possible that this game was a game on Saturday, May 25th in 1912, because it's not a school day. It's not a Sunday when the family would have been at church. Family's not at Walloon Lake. If it was that game, that's a very interesting game because it was a 5-4 White Sox victory in the 17th inning. So they certainly also would have had more time to take photographs. It was almost a 4-hour game. So we don't know for sure the baseball game, but that is where the detective work has taken us so far. So there you go. Those are the Hemingway photos and the solutions that we have come up with so far. So now here's another Hemingway baseball mystery for you. This is from A Farewell to Arms. That was what you did. You died. You did not know what it was about. You never had time to learn. They threw you in and told you the rules, and the first time they caught you off base, they killed you. So one of the questions I had about this passage was whether Hemingway was the first person to use the idiom caught off base in a novel. Because it is an idiomatic expression for baseball, and it wouldn't have been a very old expression when Hemingway was growing up. So I didn't know whether it had happened before, whether other people had used it or not. And this is another one where John Hargrove helped me out and did a lot of research on this. And he found right back in 1907 a hippo being like a baseball player stepping off base. So there's definitely earlier examples of this in writing, but it's not very popular until after Hemingway's novel. So it looks like Hemingway may not have invented this baseball idiom, but it's entirely possible that he popularized this baseball idiom because A Farewell to Arms was a very popular book. So you'll see here a quote from a 1929 novel that's perhaps imitating Hemingway. So more about Farewell to Arms. This is of interest to you, not Chicago baseball, but this is a player that Hemingway might have seen playing in Chicago against Chicago teams, and that's Babe Ruth. And this picture shows Babe Ruth the way that Hemingway would have seen him when he was growing up, because Babe Ruth was first a pitcher before he was a Yankee batter. And in A Farewell to Arms, Hemingway actually pays tribute to Babe Ruth as a pitcher in this passage, which is a quote from the novel. The Chicago White Sox were winning the American League pennant, and the New York Giants were leading the National League. Babe Ruth was a pitcher then playing for Boston. Now, here's another Chicago baseball mystery about Hemingway, and I don't have an answer for this one. Did he see a Chicago Whales game? Hemingway was growing up in Chicago during the very short-lived Federal League. So it's possible, and it would be interesting. And again, this is something hopefully Hemingway was a pack rat. Hopefully something shows up and we get a ticket stub that shows that he saw a Whales game. Another mystery, did he see a Chicago American Giants game? The so-called Negro Leagues teams did have a team in Chicago, and it would be interesting to know whether he saw them play. And the 1917 World Series Game 1, could Hemingway have gone to this game? He wrote about it. There's a passage about this game in the short story Crossing the Mississippi. And it sounds like an eyewitness account, but again, Hemingway could have just read about the game. Did he attend Game 1 of the World Series? It did happen before he went to Kansas City to take up newspaper work there. So he was in town, but I don't know whether he was able to get a ticket. That would be another one that would be fascinating to find some kind of proof. And here I have another tantalizing Chicago baseball mystery for you that we are unlikely ever to know the situation, but you'll see in this slide a very famous Chicagoan, Al Capone. He moved to town almost at the same time Hemingway moved to town. Hemingway grew up in Oak Park, but he actually lived in Chicago proper in the early 1920s and was working there. And Al Capone came to town at almost exactly the same time. Did they ever attend a baseball game at the same time? That's unlikely to be something we will ever find out, but it's kind of interesting to think about these two extremely larger than life Americans, both baseball fans, attending a game possibly at the same time. And this is a photo of a baseball game, Chicago baseball game that Capone did attend. And finally, I'm going to end with this, a solved baseball mystery. Last summer, when I was giving this talk, one of the people who was attending the talk asked if Hemingway had ever met Joe DiMaggio. And the reason for the question was that Hemingway's novel with the most baseball references in it is Old Man and the Sea. Santiago is constantly talking about the baseball news. And so there's tons and tons and tons of baseball references in Old Man and the Sea. And many of them are about Joe DiMaggio. And Santiago is giving himself strength to fight the big fish that he's caught and to hang on to it and to ward off the sharks by thinking about Joe DiMaggio playing through the pain of his heel spur. So this is one I didn't know the answer to last summer when I was asked. And again, this is John Hargrove's amazing research. He has found evidence that, in fact, Hemingway and Joe DiMaggio were part of the same party at a boxing match. And so this was after Hemingway wrote Old Man and the Sea. So now we still have a tantalizing baseball mystery. Did he know Joe DiMaggio in person before he wrote the novel? That would also be interesting to know. But it looks like for sure they met afterwards. Then they knew one another after he wrote the novel. And so you'll see the write-up in the newspaper that appeared after the game and also the photograph that appeared of them in the paper. And that's it. So hopefully I've answered some baseball questions, but also left some tantalizing things on the floor. And people will, there's still tons and tons of stuff, including in Cuba. Some of these things could be still in boxes somewhere with the answers to these questions.
All right. Thank you, Sharon. If anyone has any questions, by all means, you can type those into the chat box and I will ask them. A couple of questions that come up just from your presentation. You mentioned that the Tigers were a favorite of Hemingway's, and not to give it away, but I grew up in Michigan, so the Tigers obviously were my favorite growing up. But I'm curious, you made a statement, and I'm just curious how do you know that the Tigers were one of his favorites?
Where I fortunately have right beside me, this is the Hemingway Letters Volume 1. So
Mhm.
I mentioned the main clue is from the letter that he wrote ordering his action figures,
Ah,
the baseball action figures. So he orders, they're 35 cents each for his baseball action figures, and he orders 2 of them were tigers. So this and this, interestingly, his order was made in 1912. So this is also fascinating, right? Because we did that research. The JFK thought that those 5 Hemingway baseball photos were from 1915, but it looks like they're from 1912. And he ordered the action figures in 1912. So it'll be interesting to think maybe before or after that game. And 2 of them were tigers. He ordered an action figure of Tiger outfielder Sam Crawford. And he also ordered one of shortstop Owen Donnie Bush. So there you go. So there's 2 we know he liked for sure.
okay.
Enough to
Interesting.
spend money on them.
70
35 cents.
cents.
Actually, that's a lot of money in 1912. It doesn't
Yeah.
sound like a lot, but for that's at a time where you could buy a meal for a quarter.
Mhm.
That's a lot of money.
Um, with regards to Hemingway, the extended Hemingway family, obviously we know Anson, AKA the rifle arm third baseman, his paternal grandfather, who probably didn't have a rifle arm, but he's playing third base, so he must have had an arm. And obviously, the Hemingway lineage is connected to Wheaton College, including his paternal mother, who graduated from Wheaton, in addition to Anson. But his father, Clarence, he went to Oberlin, and I'm curious, have you ever run into anything in terms of him having played baseball? Just throwing it out there, only in the sense that if his father played baseball and his son is this is the greatest thing ever. Have you ever found a connection to Clarence in baseball?
No, I don't recall reading that. And I looked, but now of course I'm going to write it down, and I will have to look for you. I did look at, um, I looked at Clarence's own photographs when I was at the JFK, and the ones we know that are his, including photos that he took when he was at college.
Correct.
And he he took one with his friends on a bicycle, so he definitely was into some of these, sporty things.
Mhm.
And as you know, he loved the same things he taught his son to love. He loved hiking, he loved fishing, and um, so a lot of the photos that he took are camping photos, frankly. I mean, they're he's helped found or was headed, I think he helped to found, right, the Agassiz Club in Oak Park. At any
Right.
rate, he was certainly
He
running it
did.
when Hemingway was in it. Um, and so that was sort of a, natural history science type club. So I didn't run across a
Mhm.
baseball photo in his collection at the JFK, but certainly these other outdoors things. But that's a good question. I don't know, because you think that the grandfather played, and Hemingway tried. Did Clarence have some? Clarence had better eyes than Hemingway. I don't know.
Right.
Maybe.
So just a question. A question that's come up, if you have any comments, what about the baseball field he made for the boys and local kids? I think Viega in Cuba, and the team he sponsored with jerseys. Anything you can add about that?
Well, sure. That was something that it's very touching. There's a book called The Home Run Kid, that's written by one of the Cuban boys who played on the GG All Stars. That Hemingway created this team for his son Gregory, and I guess Patrick played too, in Havana. And the kids in the Home Run Kid, one of the things he talks about is the fact that there was racism, and so he talks about the fact that um, white kids could play, but you couldn't necessarily play if you were another color, and also poverty, that you couldn't necessarily get the equipment. And so he wrote actually very beautifully about the fact that Hemingway supplied all of these kids with not only equipment but new equipment, with bats and balls and gloves. And he just talks about how amazing that was, that it was something that they never expected to have, and was just this, must have seemed like a dream come true. So it's something that and Hemingway, keeping in with his lifelong love of baseball but not being necessarily very good at it, he pitched to them. And so in The Home Run Kid, one of the things, and it's a beautiful book, one of the things he writes about is the fact that Hemingway would come out and pitch to the kids. So it it was really, it wasn't just the hands-off thing, that he bought the equipment for his own sons and for these local kids to play together, but that he was actively involved, and right to the end of his life, loved baseball so much. And in fact, that One True podcast episode I mentioned that I was interviewed on, the Hemingway and Baseball One True podcast, they play a recording with the same person who wrote The Home Run Kid,
Hmm.
and it giving his memory. So you can actually hear, it's actually very beautiful to hear the audio of him recalling
Hmm.
what it was like to play baseball, actually on the grounds of the finca.
Oh, I'm surprised Hemingway didn't write down those stat lines from those games he played with those kids. I mean, he did that, like in our archives. We actually have his notebook, and he basically writes his stats down from the kids he knocked out when he had his boxing matches in the music room at the boyhood home. Literally, it says, W, loss. Not too many losses in his boxing career as a teenager. But
Well,
go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say about the things about, we never know though. A lot of the things that are at the finca are still being archived.
Right.
So it's different from Oak Park and what's at the JFK. And I wrote them recently and I still haven't been able to get the answer. Hemingway had in his personal library in Cuba a book that was a sports anthology. And the reason he had the book was his own writing was in it. One of his bullfighting uh, nonfiction pieces was in this sports anthology. But the very first piece, which gave the whole anthology its name, was Say It Ain't So.
Mm.
And so the very first piece in the book was about the Black Sox scandal. And what I would like to know is, I know Hemingway had the book, the list of the books that are at the finca, it's available online. But what I wanted to find out, and I haven't been able to find out yet, is did he write something in that chapter? Like, wouldn't it be great to know, like, those bums,
Yeah, yeah.
or
He
um,
annotated it. Yeah,
I
yeah.
still haven't forgiven them, right? And when I wrote the people who are responsible for running the finca, and I asked them this question, they said that the book has not been, the pages haven't been scanned. And so they said there was no way for them to send me digital scans. And at that time, because of COVID, and I think still, things were, you know, it was harder to get access to materials at the finca, and there'd been some disruption to the sort of the archival work. But what one woman wrote me back, and she said, Hemingway wrote in his books all the time. So that's to your point, Keith. He wrote in books all the time.
Mhm.
So those scores with the games with the kids could be in those books. And she said all over the place, the most common thing is apparently grocery lists and cockfighting scores. but she did say he constantly wrote in his books. So that's another, I didn't mention it today in this presentation, but it is another Chicago baseball mystery that I would love to know. It would be fantastic to know, even if he underlined things, right? Because
Mhm.
he lived through the Black Sox scandal. So it would be really neat to know um, if he recorded any of his reactions.
Um, Another question. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or not, but you'd mentioned Tinker to Everest to Chance. Joe Tinker actually lived in Oak Park.
Oh,
So
that's cool.
and he lived in Oak Park from, I think, 1908 to 1914. And I'm pretty sure he was with the Cubs 02 to 1902 to 1912, I think. So he lived like within a mile of Hemingway uh, for part of that time there for those. And I'm curious, um, you wouldn't have this answer now, but certainly as you delved more, or maybe have John look at this, Mr. Hargrove. But I'd be curious to see if he ever actually met Joe Tinker at some point, being so close or whatever, and I don't know the extended, if I know Joe Tinker was married. I don't know if he had kids or, what age, and, then there would be that connection too, but potentially, but anyway, so a Cub lived in Oak Park within a mile of where, when Hemingway was growing up. So there's an opportunity there as well. So,
Well, this actually does sound like something for John to read. The reason why he's been, among other things, such a great aid to me is he does incredible archival newspaper research. And he's been reading his way through the oak leaves and
mhm,
other local papers, and so has really become an expert on what they were saying about Hemingway and what was going on. And so, to your point, what would be really interesting is, was he invited to speak at the schools or to a club or
right.
something like that where Hemingway might well have been in attendance? Um, because
Uh-huh.
you've raised a really good point, right? Because he'd be a local celebrity, and that's exactly the kind of thing that schools do, right? And then is there reporting on that? So that's
Right.
exactly. I think
So,
this is certainly something we'll have to send
well,
John to
and
look for.
I know, John, I know you're on
Does he
you're,
want to volunteer a comment? I
yeah,
think
yeah,
he's on the call.
he is on the call. So I know you could definitely go to the OPRF History Museum, and they have a bunch of files on Joe Tinker as well. So, okay, another question. So the photo, and you had it earlier in your presentation, um, the photo of Hemingway with the bat and the kids around the tent. I think it's up in Walloon Lake. And so the question is, there are a couple boys in baseball gear, some older girls dressed differently that look like they're about to play a game. Any backstory known about that? And I think you have some backstory in terms of who some of those kids are, if I'm not mistaken.
You're the one who knows. It's written on the photo.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. I don't have a photo in front of me though, but any more backstory that you know of that, or
you know what, the main writing we have about Hemingway as you know, a kid playing with other kids comes from the memoirs of his siblings. And as far as I know, the most extensive stuff about Hemingway as a baseball non-player is from his brother's memoir, from Lester's memoir, My Brother Ernest Hemingway.
Right.
And he's the one who talks about the fact that Hemingway um, you know, didn't have great eyesight and often would actually choose to read. You know, when people said there's a game going, would you like to play? He'd say, no, I'm going to read. And Lester's theory was that yes, Hemingway loved reading, but he also thought he was maybe a bit embarrassed about the fact that he wasn't such a fantastic player. And I think it must have been, I mean, it must have been hard for him because you know, I mean, he admired this game so much and he admired its best players so much, and he constantly, in Hemingway's letters as an adult, he constantly compares himself to baseball players. So and to their excellence, right? And so I think that, you know, he was never able to sort of do it on the field, except maybe a little bit in the finca playing with the kids there. He could pitch to the kids as an adult and not feel pressure, but as a child he would, that's different, right? Because you're playing against other children who may have more talent and ability than you have. And I think
Mm-hmm.
he did feel probably a bit of a sensitivity on that point. At any rate, I'm willing to trust Lester on that one. I think that he does give us the most of a portrait, not specifically that what you're talking about, the baseball photo,
Right, right,
but definitely overall he sort of says, yeah, he kind of avoided it.
right.
And I mean, and he also, I think he felt a bit sheepish about other aspects of his not being such a great sports player. And in fact, Lester also talks about the fact that this is why Hemingway learned to box, right? He really felt like if other kids challenged him or made fun of him, he had to be able to hit them,
Mm-hmm.
which is something he never stopped doing. Adults, you know, had this,
Right.
he would
Well, and I
challenge
could
them to fights
see
too. So
also, but if you, I could also see it being a defense mechanism in the sense that, I mean, if you look at those pictures of Hemingway in high school and so forth, he dwarfs a lot of the kids in his high school class. He's a big kid. And so for him not to be able to show the athleticism of being that big has to be kind of
right,
a hurtful
exactly.
as well. And then boxing is a way that because he is bigger, he can actually use those advantages in a way that he can't use them or hasn't been able to, wasn't able to show them in baseball. Or he played football and he actually ran some track. He wasn't very good tracker
No,
swimming either, I
exactly.
don't think. So, but I'm speculating here, but I could see where he may.
Sure, of course, that it would feed the sensitivity because you would think that someone that size would be really good at sports, and he
Right,
wasn't necessarily. And I think it's the same sensitivity with coming back from the First World War and constantly walking around in uniform.
right,
But he hadn't been a combatant. He couldn't
right.
because his eyesight was bad. But I think there was sensitivity about that as well, right? The fact that he hadn't been permitted to be a soldier in that way.
Right, right. So, I mean, it's kind of, it comes down to that whenever you're playing a game, when you're a kid like that, and they're choosing sides, and then Hemingway would be concerned that he's the biggest kid on the court, but he's the last kid chosen, right? Because people would know by then if he doesn't have that athleticism, whatever. But anyways, moving on. So, any idea what baseball jerseys Hemingway may have owned?
Now that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that
Yeah,
one. I mean, he definitely loved going to New York games, and now so that's worth exploring. Did he actually wear the merch though? I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Well, I would say, although I probably in his day back then, they probably didn't have the names on the back of the jersey,
No,
right? Because I'm like,
no.
he definitely wouldn't have worn a jersey if it had someone else's name on the back of it, right?
But
I
as
think
an adult, he went to a lot of New York games. He loved New York games. So that's a good question. And it would be interesting to see if anyone has anything on that. But then, as you said, maybe there's a contradiction there that Hemingway wouldn't necessarily be promoting someone other than
I
himself.
have
And
a hard time thinking he'd put anyone's last name on. He wouldn't wear something, but if the last name was on it, but
that's why I like more of the speculation. I love the idea that he was probably at some point in a ballpark with Al Capone. He was also probably in a ballpark at some point with Babe Ruth playing on the field. So, I mean, that's something that well, and of course he would have seen Shoeless Joe Jackson. So there's these, to your point, maybe he wouldn't promote these other people in competition with himself. He was always very competitive, but he would definitely appreciate that greatness. And
Right,
he
right.
was definitely there to see some of these really ultra famous players play, and may have been in the same arena with Al Capone, who became famous like Hemingway, but for a different way, but on the same level, which is crazy.
Right.
The fact that two of the people in Chicago in exactly the same years went on to become just such larger than life figures in popular culture.
Right. Okay, so I think potentially our last question here. So from Jana, I was interested in your insights on his writing life and how much he valued excellence. I also wondered, is there something that most stuck with you, or that you've most appreciated learning in your writing and research process on Hemingway?
Well, I mean, I think that it is fascinating that he compared himself as a writer so often to baseball players. And he would talk about hitting the ball hard and true, like writing like that kind of hit. And that's something he wrote to one of his friends at the New Yorker. And I think that for me, first of all, it was very moving to read that, because as we've discussed this evening, he wasn't actually very good at playing baseball, but he loved the idea of being in some way like his heroes. And so he could write as well as they could hit, or as well as they could pitch. And he really admired the pitchers. And I think for me personally, I think anyone who's a writer, that's an amazing takeaway, to aim for your best. What is the best that you can do? And also to try to, that idea of aiming true, to try to be really precise, which, as we know with Hemingway, with his writing and with his editing, that he was just incredibly precise. And always, the multiple endings, I was thinking it was over 40 endings or something of A Farewell to Arms before he finally said, okay, this is it. Just painstaking process. And so I think that that's where, to your point about writing and your point about excellence, that this vision of Hemingway and baseball kind of merges, because you think he saw Babe Ruth hit the ball, right? He saw Christy Mathewson pitch. He saw some of the best who've ever, and Tinkers, Evers, and Chats. He saw some of the best who've ever played this game, and in his own game at writing, he wanted people to say he was as good, and I think he achieved that. So that's actually pretty amazing, to pick role models like that as a child, and then actually to live up to that role model in your own domain.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think any last questions, anyone? Otherwise, I think we're squared away for this evening. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have some more programming coming up the end of April on Arbor Day, and kind of featuring poetry. April's Poetry Month. Hemingway also was a poet, not necessarily a very good one, but he did publish some poetry. So we'll be having an event here in Oak Park on Arbor Day on the 26th, and some more events in May and so forth. We hope to have some hybrid or Zoom additional events regarding with our series on the 21st century of Hemingway. And we thank you all for joining us. And Sharon, thank you for rejoining us again and going over this talk. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Have a good night, and everyone enjoy baseball season. Talk soon.